Okay. Xiang?
Yeah, hi. My questions are for Isaac. So I think your study is very interesting and it yields a lot of very fruitful insights and draws on a lot of good research about the Singapore education system. So I really enjoyed that. But I do have two questions. One's a critique and one perhaps is a guide for further research. So the first question is regarding the sort of three factors you see as being bulwarks against populism, which basically are pragmatism, multiculturalism, and meritocracy, if I'm not wrong. As I understand, however, from following the events in the Western countries, for instance, where a lot of this populism is taking place, it's actually precisely these three factors that the populists are actually revolting against in the first place. So I was wondering whether you could say that maybe there is a sort of intervening factor that is differentiating why a populist challenge has appeared in the West but not in Singapore, and perhaps you want to do a more comparative study with the situation in the Western countries right now. The second is sort of like reference to your pointing out the fact that many of these movements are led by what I like to call disaffected elites, where it's people who are apparently elite, like Trump, perhaps Duterte, and all of them who are educated in some way, but they choose to abandon the so-called elite stratum of society and side with the populist forces. Actually, if you think about it, in a lot of history, there are a lot of similar sort of social movements and like even revolutionary movements like French Revolution, Russian Revolution, which are led by actually people from a similar socio-economic background. I was wondering maybe if you want to pursue this further, you could actually look at this particular sort of individual as a sort of social movement leader and study in greater detail. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks for your comments. So I think on your first point, I think you're absolutely right, because it is these three ideologies that populists say have fallen. So for example, elites overseas are not meritocratic. They probably bought their way in or something like that. And pragmatism, there's no such thing as, not no such thing, but they don't practice really the pragmatic politics that we see here. And multiracialism is sort of quite, I wouldn't say unique, but Singapore practices a very strong form of multiracialism. I think the intervening factor, so to speak here, is that the state has been able to have a strong role in maintaining these ideologies. So whether through laws or whether through control of the discourse through the media, that sort of thing. And that has essentially allowed these three ideologies to still have a very firm hold in Singapore. So I think that is the intervening factor, that the state has been able to maintain and ensure that these three ideologies stay dominant, whether through institutions or through state work, in that sense. And on the second one, so sorry, could you repeat it again? So the study of movements with leaders from a similar socio-economic background to the disaffected people?
I think it's more of a sense that if you notice throughout history, most of these sort of social movements and political revolutions tend to be led by people of similar background to your populist leaders. We should call them insurgent elites, disaffected elites or whatever, or basically elites who are from that sort of very high stratum, but they turn their backs on it and they actually start fighting against it themselves. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to look at these individuals, why people from such a background tend to, yeah.
Yeah, I do think that's quite interesting, and yeah, I'll take your word and do more research into this.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, I'll add one. So I wanted to ask, especially our researchers who did a lot of empirical work, so maybe to start with Vincent, could you tell us a bit more about the variety of stories you heard? Because you isolate it down to particular themes, but were there kind of counterexamples or people who express really different sentiments about their coming out experience?
Surprisingly, the people that I spoke to, so it's about 15 Singaporean gay men. Surprisingly, none of them had an issue sort of speaking about their sexuality to me. So I initially thought that there would be a bit of resistance to speak to this random guy who approached them to ask about something so private. And I conducted all the interviews in quite a public area. But of course, I made sure that they were comfortable with it. Yeah, so one thing that I noticed is that none of these 15 men were sort of in any way uncomfortable with speaking. But of course, there were varieties. So there were people who were openly homosexual, and there were others that were more from conservative backgrounds. For example, one of my participants, he is Indian and he's Muslim. So he told me that he could never tell his family about his sexuality because the Indian Muslim community in Singapore is so small that if he does speak about it, it's not only his family that will find out, but everyone else in the same community will. And because his mom is a religious leader, it would create a lot of problems for him. So they range from people who are quite open about it to the very sort of conservative people.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to ask you, Al, one thing that I feel might come to mind for people hearing about this forest school is kind of how do you deal with something like class? Like who attends this school? You know, what kind of students, what kind of parents bring their kids here, and how do you think that interfaces with like the possibility of this education being really transformative for people?
It's a very good question. I didn't think in the preparation for this, that wasn't one of them that I thought of. No, I think that's a really good question, and I think my answer is less in terms of like whether like what class factoring into the kinds of education that happens, but rather the forest school's curriculum and pedagogy as a way of rethinking Singapore education, broadly speaking. Because I think that Singapore education right now there's a lot of discussion going on. And last semester we talked with Xixiang as well at NUS about this and in terms of inequality. And I think preschool especially is being a huge focus in educational discourse today. And my point is that, okay, so we talk a lot about this, but not together with climate change. And not only that, like class and all these things are definitely a factor. And one thing I can say about the forest school that I find really interesting is that the coach and the founder would look through the kind of like means-based testing and means-based pricing to cater to a range of classes. So I think, and the government is doing the same thing, right? In the National Day rally speech, but in that sense, so. Definitely class plays a huge factor, and I think if you want to take another angle on that, like I think Teo Yan's work, thinking about kind of the different kinds of tracks that class produces is really, really important, and that's the things that I'm trying to push back against, this kind of like socioeconomic class inequality, and try to rethink education, like, I mean, in PM Lee's words, you know, like we want the best for every child, right? And in that sense, like what can we learn from the forest school, and what conversations can we have to think about this beyond? So like, okay, like we can do with class inequality, but beyond that, right? What can we do with pedagogy? What can we do with this like this crisis of climate change? And all these have to be discussed together, as opposed to what kind of class in, you know, like goes to forest school. I think the relevance of my research is less in terms of addressing one particular small niche of socioeconomic inequality, but really trying to push back against that and look at education broadly speaking in Singapore.
So then I also wanted to ask, to follow up on that, in your presentation, it kind of seems almost inevitable that if kids learn about nature, they'll care about climate change. Maybe this is because you only had 10 minutes. But I wanted to ask kind of what sort of interventions do people like the teachers make if they are trying to generate or cultivate this kind of consciousness? I'm just thinking, especially coming from a Western context myself, maybe you could play outside and say, yay, like this hill is mine to conquer. And that's not exactly what they're going for either. So how do the teachers facilitate this?
Sorry, so the question is how teachers facilitate a sense of like cultivating nature. And so many ways. So, like for example, we went into the field, like the clearing, and then there was like a lizard on the ground, and then the coach was like, "Oh, look at this!" And then we're like, "Oh, okay, interesting. It's so beautiful. Can I touch it?" So thinking about a lizard, like, come on, that's not that beautiful in the traditional sense of the word, but hey, it's you know, like thinking about like playing in the mud, all these different things, and having another, like an alternative way of like understanding nature and being in nature, as opposed to just like being in a very clean environment and like just staying in the classroom. So I think that's part of the strategy in forest schools, like pedagogy and curriculum, in both exposing students to nature. Yeah, so I think did I answer? And
maybe also
second,
does the school have an eye particularly towards climate change, towards having the kind of mindset that would prompt you to take action to protect the Earth?
Yeah, I think this is a question I struggled in the research, right? I think in terms of methodology as well, how do you balance the empirical evidence with kind of the essay that you want to write? So am I going to write an essay based on entirely empirical evidence? It might as well just be a catalog. At the same time, how can I make an argument about climate change? Because I think that's important. So I think there was a balancing act in both of that, thinking about how this empirical evidence, what does that tell us, rather than just like documenting it. And not being pushed around by my evidence, because I think that definitely, there are aspects in the curriculum, whether it's said or unsaid, that does help us think about strategies to mitigate against climate change in the educational system, whether it's an explicit, like the coach says, okay, today we're gonna fight climate change, and tomorrow, no, I don't think it's about that, but it's about elements in the curriculum and the pedagogy that allow us to talk about this. So I think, yes, so in terms of methodology, that's kind of the balancing act. No, they're not an activist group that fights against climate change on like a let's go now kind of basis, but there are a lot of lessons that can be learned that are deviate from a traditional educational track in Singapore that speak a lot to this current problem.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another audience question.
I have a question for Vincent, actually. With regards to the group of people that you spoke to, or even with sort of the evidence that you came across researching this topic, have you ever discovered anyone who specifically used that phrase very intentionally to come out as a sort of way to, because it can come off, as you said, very rough and maybe even antagonistic, as a way to other themselves from whoever they were coming out to? So was there sort of anyone that did it with precisely the intention that others avoided?
I don't think so. A few of my participants did say that while they would avoid those words, "I am gay," they have used it before, and the only reason, or one of the reasons why they did use those words was to this particular guy, he wanted to communicate the idea in a way that did not confuse his mother. He was afraid that his mother might think, so like if he were to say the things like, I like boys, so his mom might think, do you like girls also? And he wanted to get it like across, so he just said the words, "I'm gay." But I don't think it's intentionally to sort of other his mother or sort of to piss off the other person, because I believe, and I might be generalizing here, but I believe most queer people want to be accepted as queer people when they do come out. So yeah, I don't think so. Yeah. Thank you.
I also had a question for Hema. I wanted to ask, in your theory about how this synergy works, right, between civil society and politicians, how do you think the aspect that AWARE was able to gather ground knowledge and lived experience also kind of added to that as part of what made them effective?
I don't think it added much to the synergy aspect. That's just, as I explained just now, it added to the complementarity part of synergy, which was them sort of contributing to the division of labor between the state actor and AWARE. But that's pretty much it. It's just contributing to the division of labor and then them providing the best, the resources that they're most able to provide. And that basically led to that particular version of synergy, which is complementarity, and then that paved the way for a developmental outcome. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you. Please help me thank all of our presenters.